So let's look at the compare mode in SCA. So this is where we're going to think about questions like how can we compare the consequences of the different courses of action? What criteria are used for the comparison? And what uncertainties are relevant? In principle, many methods of predicting the effects of proposed courses of action and evaluating one against another will be compatible with the SCA. So, at this point, you can bring any way of comparing courses of action into SCA. It's not restrictive, but it is important that all sources of uncertainty are brought to the surface so they can be managed, because if you remember, SCA feels very strongly about that. This is particularly true of uncertainties about value judgments. So SCA favours a multi-criteria type of evaluation rather than a single objective function. So it assumes that when you're comparing courses of action, there's going to be several criteria, if you like, that need to be taken into consideration. Now, SCA uses the term comparison area rather than the usual decision analysis term of criterion, but it's the same idea. So if we go back to the manufacturing example, we have 5 criteria or comparison areas. Okay, so for the managers in this particular problem, they feel that capital outlay, expansion potential, acceptability to employees, internal communication, and company image are the key things that need to be taken into account and evaluated when choosing between the different courses of action that have been identified in the previous stage. So often a problem focus involves several linked decision areas. So in this particular one we've got 4, and quite quickly there are too many feasible options to handle. Now in this particular example we've got 11 feasible courses of action, and comparing 11 feasible courses of action starts to get very difficult. So we do actually want to see if we can cut down that list to a smaller list quickly before going into a deeper comparison process. So in the spirit of dynamic comparison, we need to first create a working shortlist using crude constraints and a limited set of comparison areas first. So the shortlist of schemes can then be compared in more detail with a wider set of comparison areas and a fuller examination of areas of uncertainty. The schemes originally omitted can re-enter the analysis later on if this is deemed desirable by the team. So we need to remember this is a learning process. So if we want to go back, do something again, bring something back into the analysis, that's absolutely fine. So how do we score the options or the decision scheme? So each option or decision scheme constitutes a set of choices in relation to the chosen decision areas. So each option needs to be scored on each of the comparison areas. So we had 5, if you remember. Now we're going to go with a subset initially. So we're going to cut that 5 down to 3 initially to get us a short list. So how do we score? Well, there's lots of different ways of scoring depending on the thing that we're actually looking at. So we could put a quantitative value in. So for example, we might put a cost value in or a profit prediction in. We can have a judgment scale from 1 to 9. For example, scheme A might be judged to have the most income potential for a particular local authority, and scheme F might be the least, and then we could score all the other schemes between those top and bottom. We could also use a star rating, so for example, quality of life for local residents rated 1 to 5 star. Okay, so there's lots of different ways of scoring. Now if we go back to our example of the manufacturing firm, what we're going to do here is do an initial scoring. So if you remember, we had 11 feasible courses of action. So we've got scheme A, B, C, D, E, all the way to K. So we've got 11 courses of action, and we want to score each of those courses of action. So rather than doing all 5 of the criteria, we're going to select 3. So capital requirements, expansion potential, and internal communication, and we're going to score them. And so we're going to score capital. We can use a quantitative measure of cost, stick that straight in there. Now the expansion potential is simply a judgment from 1 to 9. So here we can see that the course of action K has been scored with a 1 in terms of expansion potential. So that's our best. And then in terms of communication, we're scoring them 1 to 5 star. So we can see that K has a 5-star rating for internal communication, whereas F and H are scored as 1 star. So we get a sense of scoring systematically across all of those 11 feasible options. So we can sort of get that down to a shortlist. So I've put we've got a tick there against schemes B, E, G, I, because they're the ones that look the most promising at this stage. So once we've got that down to 3 or 4 schemes, it becomes possible to compare alternatives in more depth, one-on-one. So the simplified scales can still be used, but we can also allow indications of uncertainty as well, because at the end of the day there will be uncertainty about these evaluations. That these are not always quantitative judgments by any stretch. So we can express uncertainty by using comparative comments against each of the comparison areas. So for comparison areas using quantitative values like cost, we can add surprise limits to, for example, like a confidence interval. So we might, put a cost against something, but actually that's a prediction of cost. And we can use the notion of comparative advantage as an overall judgment scale and ranges to indicate uncertainty. So let's just see what that looks like. So here, if we think about comparing scheme B against scheme I, we're going to systematically do that against all of the 5 comparison areas that we identified. So we've got capital outlay, expansion potential, acceptability to employees, internal communication, and company image. So capital outlay, it's a straight quantitative evaluation. So scheme B cost 135 against scheme I at 105. Okay, so scheme I could cost about 30 units less than B. Okay, and we might put surprise limits there from 10 to 50. Okay, so that's a relatively straightforward comparison. Expansion potential, they're both rated at 6, so there's no discernible difference, but level of uncertainty is quite high. Okay, that's our judgment. Acceptability to employees, scheme B is likely to be more acceptable to most employees. Okay, that's our judgment. Internal communication, so scheme B gets 2 stars, scheme I gets 3 stars, so scheme I is likely to present fewer difficulties in terms of internal communication. And finally, company image, there's strong difference of opinion on the board. Okay, so so we can't get agreement on that one. So some people think scheme B, some people think scheme I. There's clearly differences of opinion there, so we record that. Now, we can also try and use this scheme, which is a more visual way of representing all of those different criteria. So issues of judgment arise at many levels in making assessments within comparison areas. However, creating an overall preference judgment by combining comparison areas is even more tricky. Okay, so the concept of comparative advantage is used to help with this judgment, and the influence of uncertainty is expressed through the use of ranges here. Okay, so you can see again we've got the 5 criteria. So we've got capital outlay, expansion potential, acceptability to employees, internal communication, and company image. And we've got the relative advantage to scheme B, and we've got the relative advantage to scheme I. So we can see that in terms of capital outlay, scheme I has a significant advantage over scheme B, and so we can see that the line is to the right, and that we've got a reasonably wide element of uncertainty, but we can see that clearly scheme I is winning on that criteria. Now, expansion potential is right down the middle, so it's absolutely in the middle there. Acceptability to employees, we can see that scheme B is winning that one. Internal communication, slightly towards scheme I. And company image, there's a lot of uncertainty there, there's a lot of disagreement. So overall, we get the feeling that if we sort of try and combine that together, that scheme I seems to be sort of coming out on top there, but it's not a clear winner by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, so we can sort of try and graphically represent how scheme B is stacking up against scheme I using this graphical schema. Now you can see there's lots of judgment there, there's lots of uncertainty there, but it is a very systematic way of recording all of that. Very powerful way of getting people to actually come to that degree of analysis about these two schemes across quite a complex set of criteria. Okay, so that's the end of the compare video.